Great. See some names in the chat. All right, we are up to 26 folks in climbing, so I will get us kicked off here. Thanks, everybody. Really excited to chat about federal policy today. And thanks for joining us. My name is Reed Setzer. I am our Director of Government Affairs here at EdTrust. Joining me today is Courtney Bollig, Senior Associate for Government Affairs and Communications. Again, please go ahead, keep introducing yourselves in the chat. Great to see everybody. I'm really excited to do this boot camp presentation today for all y'all. And as we move forward, feel free to just keep introducing yourself and putting questions into the chat. Today's breakout session is called Federal Education Policy and Advocacy Opportunities in 2021. With that, I will turn it over to Courtney to get us started.
Yes, thanks, Reed. Hi, everybody. We have a lot to cover in a short period of time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Please continue to introduce yourself, as Reed said. We're going to go over how we're going to spend our time today. Here you'll see the goals for our conversation as well as the content that we'll cover. A quick note before we get started regarding our advocacy. This presentation is being performed for strategic planning purposes only, so that your organizations can begin to think about how federal policies may or may not impact your agenda and how your agendas might align with our own. We would ask that for those reasons you not share this material or the recording publicly, but rather just to inform your own advocacy. With that, let's get started. We are going to do a quick overview, and by I mean quick and high-level overview, I am not joking, of the two most recent COVID relief packages. The last one being passed in December of 2020. I'll be calling it the December 2020 year-end package because the acronym is very hard. And the government passed that year-end funding package. It's $900 billion in COVID relief, as well as $1.4 trillion in appropriations funding that will keep the government funding through the end of September. In addition, there were also several higher education provisions that were included in this bill. So we're just going to give a quick overview of what was included in all of those things, in all of those three kind of components of this package. So if you want to drill down into the details of this bill, I do encourage you to look on our website to find fact sheets on each piece of legislation. I will also put them in the chat during this session so you can find them, and they're also linked in the slideshow. As you'll remember, the CARES Act, which was passed in March of 2020, established an Education Stabilization Fund, ESF, a framework consisting of three buckets of funding: the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, the ESSER, the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, the HERE, and then the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, GEAR. The December 2020 year-end package utilizes this ESF framework and provides nearly $82 billion for a slightly modified ESF. The first bucket of funding, the ESSER 2 in this bill, K-12 funds are distributed using the Title I formula of ESSA. And under ESSA, once states receive these funds, they must distribute at least 90% of those funds to districts based on how much they receive under Title I. The higher education pot of money, the vast majority of this money will flow to public and private nonprofit institutions, the rest of those funds being split between HBCUs, HSIs, and other MSIs, as well as students attending for-profit institutions as well. I will note that, again, we're doing a high-level overview, so these are changes to the bills that were kind of the framework of which was established under the CARES Act. So one notable change in this December year-end package is that the formula for money in the HERE pot has been tweaked to be more inclusive of institutions enrolling part-time students. So that is something that we'd like to bring to your attention. Additionally, these funds, institutions that receive these funds must spend at least half on emergency grants to students, which was something that the CARES Act set precedent for. And then this last pot, the GEAR, is really for governors and to use on K-12 and higher education discretionary purposes. And in this package specifically, $2.75 billion is reserved for non-public schools, and the remaining 1.3 can be used for discretionary spending on education. In this package, there are also specific supports for certain programs and populations. There was funding for broadband access in this bill, $3.2 billion for low-income families, for a $50 monthly internet subsidy as well, and providers can be reimbursed up to $100 for issuing Wi-Fi connected devices. Individuals who have family members participating in the free and reduced price lunch program or receive Pell Grants are also eligible for this subsidy, as well as nutrition assistance. This bill clarified that children under 6 years of age living in households that receive SNAP automatically qualify for the pandemic EBT program. There was a temporary 15% monthly increase to SNAP benefits, as well as lifting some of the barriers to SNAP for college students temporarily. Additionally, within this bill, there, as I mentioned and alluded to, there are permanent higher education reforms, including simplifying and reforming the FAFSA, expanding Pell Grant restoration to students who were defrauded by predatory for-profit colleges, and repealing the ban on Pell eligibility for students who are incarcerated. These are changes that we were very pleased to see. These changes have different dates that they could be implemented, specifically the simplification of FAFSA and changes to the federal financial aid formula could take effect in 2023, while other provisions, including lifting the Pell ban, could take place sooner, as soon as this calendar year. And so those are the two pieces of this very massive bill in December that was passed. And then the last part is, again, the appropriations, the $1.4 trillion that was passed to fund the government. Just noting that the overall funding for the Department of Education was $73.5 billion, which is a $785 million increase from FY20. And the bill does include several plus-ups for Title I IDEA, Title II Teacher Professional Development Grants, Title IV Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants, CTE, Early Childhood Education, as well as an $150 bump to the maximum Pell Grant. So that's a very, very high-level overview. We'll make sure that you get the additional resources on this bill in particular, but we're going to fast forward a little bit to March and talk about the American Rescue Plan Act. And I'm trying to scroll down, read to get to the next slide. But this bill is a little different than the December year end. It passed via reconciliation and provides $1.9 trillion in COVID relief and makes a few changes. Let me get to this next slide. There we go. If you can see all that, I'm going to sum it up, hopefully very quickly. It was the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 was signed into law on March 11th. As I said, it disperses $1.9 trillion in COVID relief aid. That's roughly $125 billion for K-12 and nearly $40 billion for the higher education system. It's unlike CARES in the December year-end package. The American Rescue Plan does not fund the governor's pot of money in that education stabilization fund. And due to some of the restrictions of the reconciliation process, there are minor changes to existing structures of funds, which I will detail below. I'll start off by saying that this bill also includes two fiscal policies that Ed Trust is very supportive of: maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity to protect our nation's most underserved students from bearing the brunt of disproportionate cuts that we've experienced in past recessions. And we'll make sure that you get a breakdown of how those provisions in this law might apply. So we'll make sure you get those two. Just kind of, again, outlining those big buckets of the ESF. ESSER 3, this is the third pot of funds under ESSER, remains largely the same under prior COVID relief packages, but there are set-asides that are very critical and will be very critical in the weeks and months going forward as we try and account for unfinished instruction. Hang on, we went back to one slide. So let's get back. Okay, perfect. So some of the set-asides for state education agencies, SEAs, 5% to address interrupted learning for underserved students, 1% of the ESSER funds for evidence-based summer programs, and 1% for after-school programs included in ESSER. But there's also $800 million for students experiencing homelessness that was added in the Vote-A-Rama process. Of this funding, LEAs must set aside at least 20% to address interrupted learning for underserved students. There's also emergency funding assistance to non-public schools included in this pot of funds too. Worth noting, differences in the CARES Act between this pot of funding between CARES and the American Rescue Plan is within 30 days of receiving these funds, districts must release a plan that includes information about returning to in-person instruction. Districts are not required to return to in-person instruction as a condition of receiving these funds. So that's very important to know. And we know that the department is actively working to provide additional guidance and FAQs around these two pots of funds specifically. So that second pot of funding that we've covered, here in this case, HERE 3, the vast majority of the funds will flow to public and private nonprofit institutions. That is the same as CARES in the December package. Again, HBCUs, HSIs, MSIs will receive 5% of the remaining funds, as well as for students attending for-profit colleges and universities. Student or institutions, again, like CARES, will have to make emergency grants, similar to how they did under the prior packages. Additionally, a portion of these funds must be used to implement evidence-based practices to monitor and suppress COVID-19 and provide and conduct direct outreach to applicants about their ability to receive COVID-19 related financial aid adjustments. And these funds must be used by September 30th of 2023. Lastly, again, there are several investments in specific programs and populations. There's a lot of support for early childhood education, support for Head Start, CCDBG, as well as child care education stabilization funding. And then, of course, there is the child tax credit inclusion as well. There are additional investments, as you'll see on this slide, in broadband access, nutrition funding for IDEA. Additionally, EdTrust was pleased to see the 90-10 loophole closed in this legislation, which essentially means that pending a negotiated rulemaking process, GI education benefits are now deemed federal education aid for the purposes of 90-10, which bars for-profit colleges from receiving more than 90% of their funding or from their revenue from the federal government. So that was something that we believe was long overdue. Additionally, and this will be helpful as we try to address unfinished instruction, is there are investments and resources for AmeriCorps to essentially increase tutor strength through the AmeriCorps program and provide supports to hopefully scale up that national service. So again, very high level. I will put a bunch of resources in the chat, and we'll throw it over to Reed to cover the next part of our session.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. I tried to circle back to questions in the chat, but folks, keep them coming. I know we're fortunate enough to have some of our policy experts in with us as well. So feel free for those folks to reach out as well and address what I did not get to. But for my section, I'll be talking about a couple of different things. First will be what our federal priorities are, for the remainder of the year, and then also touching on the landscape, process, timing, things that could be helpful for your organizations as you're trying to navigate, the rest of this year and what you may want to dig in on and prioritize in your own advocacy. So let's get started. First is the department. So, I think before even touching on some of, our discrete requests around things that were included in ARP, I think it's useful to note off the top, there have been 3 tranches, as Courtney touched on. There was ESSER 1, 2, and 3. HERE 1, 2, and 3. As of now, HERE 2, ESSER 2 is just announced to be made fully available by the department this month. So the CARES Act from 2020, March of 2020, and the funding included in the December package should be available for states to draw down on. In terms of ESSER 3, the ARP money that was just allocated, 2/3 of that money has been made available. The remaining 1/3, the department is requiring an application. As a part of that application, we've been looking at submitting recommendations, working with other groups on how best to meet the needs of underserved populations. Within that application, and trying to get states to represent how they plan on doing that. How to exercise proper oversight, how to look at they're prioritizing the use of that money. Is it being used to accelerate student learning? All the things that, and you can see the set-asides on the slide that, there's set-aside money to do, but that's not the only money, right? There's going to need to be some of the money from the larger bucket as well that goes towards those ends. So just trying to require as much of that up front from them, so there is proper oversight, combined with representations that they will follow the instructions in the statute, specifically things like maintenance of effort and equity. Just wanted to make that note right off the top. In terms of Here 3, I know there was a question about undocumented student access. There has not been anything that's come out on Here 3 yet from the department, but they do have sites where they host everything in the existing FAQs. It's our general understanding they're not going to take the DeVos approach and end up in court. So we don't expect a denial coming from them, but they may not jump on giving clear guidance on that right away. So we're still waiting to see how they're going to go forward there as well. So turning to pieces of the ARP. So we have been focused on ensuring that the nearly $180 billion that's been allocated to our nation's schools by the previous two packages does get to the students who need it the most. Folks may be aware there was a handbook that does dive in deep in some areas on how best to address unfinished instruction. It has elements on closing the digital divide and educator diversity, addressing socio-emotional needs. However, there's going to be more detailed guidance to come, I think. And in practice for us, that's meant sharing recommendations with the department on how best they can collect data. What were students doing during the pandemic? How were they learning digital access, student attendance, learning formats? How has it impacted them academically, socially, and emotionally? And that sort of data collection should inform all of the rest of these policy bullets. So, within the ARP, as Courtney mentioned, there is a set aside for unfinished instruction. It's referred to as learning loss in the bill, but I just want to be clear, that's what I'm talking about, but that's not language that we like to use. I think unfinished instruction and accelerating learning is the best way to approach that particular challenge. However, we have shared recommendations recently on how best to implement evidence-based practices to accelerate that learning. Recently publishing 3 different briefs on the best sort of tactics and strategies to finish unfinished learning. That was also memorialized in a letter to Secretary Cardona, all of which is on the site. I see Courtney placing those resources in the chat as well. Additionally, maintenance of equity and effort. Maintenance of equity is a provision that we worked on getting placed within the law. The idea is that you're going to require states and school districts to ensure that their high need districts and schools don't shoulder a disproportionate share of any educational budget cuts. The idea is this is going to prevent largely students of color, Black and brown students, and students from low-income backgrounds, and the educators that are serving them from avoiding the type of cuts that really impacted them during the recession. So we're in a little bit of a better situation regarding state budgets than we thought we might have been. There are some that have been disproportionately impacted, mostly due to the curtailing of things like tourism. Hawaii is one state that stood out. But I think by and large, we are in a little bit better shape. So we are going to be helping Ed figure out how best to communicate, how that needs to be followed and put in place. But going forward, we do expect there'll be more from them. There was a mention of that in the handbook, but there hasn't been more on those topics yet. Additionally, there's set aside language in the ARP for evidence-based summer and after-school programs. There was a set aside for students experiencing homelessness that was actually added to the bill on the floor. So there is not a lot of parameters around how that money will be distributed. So these are all things we're going to be sort of watching and working on as Ed continues to systematically put out more and more guidance for folks in the field on how that's going to work, what the applications are going to look like, and sort of how to plan to implement those things. So finally, I'll just touch on too, there's new money in the recent package for broadband and closing the digital divide, about $7 billion. That's currently resting with FCC. The December broadband subsidy for low-income families is actually set to be implemented fairly soon. So we're tracking that as well to make sure that states, districts, and folks that families trust. It's one thing to get a letter, or it's one thing to get something from Comcast. It's another thing to get something from a teacher or a principal. So trying to make sure everyone's bought in on the availability of that to connect students at home, and improvements to nutrition programs that Courtney's led our work on that, and there'll be a little bit more. I'll touch on that later as well. But that's a part of the sort of administration-wide monitoring that we're going to be doing, not just in the Department of Ed. And finally, I wanted to touch on a really big victory that we had in December. That was mentioned previously, but ensuring that the Pell Ban for students who are incarcerated is lifted as quickly as possible. This is something that we and tons of other groups certainly have invested an immense amount of time in getting overturned. That was successfully done in December, but Ed was running and is running hundreds of experimental sites, where you have education programs going on. Now the sort of approval function of how those programs get set up and put into place is moving from Ed under the current law to now this new law to state correctional administrations, Bureau of Prisons, et cetera. So, some of them will be way ahead of the curve. Some of them will be behind the curve and trying to figure out, okay, how does this transfer over to each state individually? How are the programs essentially set up in a way that makes them quality educational programs, period, full stop? Outside of the setting that they're in, is there accurate financial aid information available, accurate information on transfer, credit usage, student affairs professionals, ways for students to file, grievances, everything that you would have, in a quote unquote brick and mortar campus as well. So that's an ongoing process. That's one of a few provisions of the ARP that can be implemented early, of the December package that can be implemented early. And we'll be tracking that as well. Finally, we actually have a Justice Fellows policy program where folks who were directly impacted, formerly incarcerated, who attained their bachelor's and master's, and are now working in this space and creating organizations in service of that community. We brought them on to use their lived experience to inform the work that we do, the work that our partners do, the work that Ed does. And Sasha Taylor on our team is leading a breakout on that at 2:35 right after this, if folks are interested in learning more. So that's the immediate sort of implementation priorities with Ed. I mean, moving now to what I think our asks always would have been, right? Like if the pandemic hadn't happened, if there wasn't an ARP, we still would be circling back on our core issue areas. And first is one that it has been tied to, the pandemic is the need to maintain statewide assessments. We believe that policymakers and parents need to get a clear picture of how students, especially historically underserved students, have been impacted. So all these resources that we just talked about can be directed as efficiently and effectively as possible. As of now, the department, has issued letters in response to several states' requests for waivers, denying nearly all of them. They have allowed for significant flexibility. Pennsylvania will be administering in the fall. Colorado is taking a grade span approach as well. But trying to help them get guidance out and continue to ensure they're enforcing the civil rights protections in the Every Student Succeeds Act is a big part of what we've been doing and will continue to do as that sort of unfolds over the next 4 to 6 months. Additionally, there's a whole host of areas of guidance that directly pertain to research work that we've done and advocacy that we've conducted. The first is this advanced coursework piece. So we have a January 2020 report that focuses on inequities in advanced coursework that showed nationally that Black and Latino students can be as successful as their white peers in advanced coursework, but are broadly denied the opportunity to partake, both in lack of availability in schools predominantly attended by Black and Latino students, but also within the schools themselves in the selection process. So there's a host of recommendations there that we'd love to see operationalized through guidance from Ed, just about universal screening and ways to share best practices and set goals on how to improve access to advanced coursework. Additionally, increasing educator diversity and improving programmatic reporting is something we'd like to see the department take action on. Secretary Cardona has talked quite a bit about the importance of educator diversity, both in his confirmation hearing as well as in recent public events. So, we're excited about that. We have a 50-state data tool that we posted last year that examines the racial diversity of each state's educator workforce. You can go, that's on our website. Very useful tool, something that I haven't seen anything like it anywhere else. But essentially improving that process and that collecting better data is going to take, just thinking about targeted data-informed efforts on how to develop those policies. So right now it's a bit of a patchwork through federal reporting, and I think at the end of the day, there's a lot more that we can do, specifically in parts of HEA, parts of ESSA, to get more better information for policymakers and prospective candidates as well. And there's also additional investments, and I'll touch more on that when we talk about the legislative side of things. But that's something we want Ed to take a much more public and prominent role on. Additionally, we want to increase access to equitable early childhood education. There's a public memo on our site that we co-wrote with the National Urban League, UNIOS US, and the National Center for Learning Disabilities. That is essentially an early childhood centric transition memo, has a host of recommendations in it that folks can look at. I'd also say there's a report from 2 years ago called Young Learners Missed Opportunities that shows just the massive disparities between access to high quality early childhood education for Black and Latino children versus white children. Out of the 26 states, we took a look at, not one provided both high quality and high access early childhood education for 3 and 4 year olds, for Black and Latino 3 and 4 year olds during the 2017-2018 school year. So there's a lot more to be done with that. I know we have future work coming out on how best to support early childhood educators of color in state and local communities as well. So I think there's a real chance for the department to lead on that too. School discipline, this is a tremendous area of focus for us. We released a report last year with the National Women's Law Center that's really much more than a report. I mean, it does do a tremendous service in sort of breaking down best practices. It does some deep dives into districts in one state that have done really well in improving and addressing the disproportionality of student discipline and school climate outcomes. But it also is, in and of itself, a brief and guidance. Basically, we've been calling it a checklist, but what it is guidance for policymakers, advocates, and school leaders to help them implement many of the suggestions supported by the research. There was school discipline guidance from the Obama administration that was rescinded, so we'd like to see that reinstituted and improved. And finally, resource equity. Right before the pandemic, our Vice President of K-12 policy, or P-12 policy, I should say, Ari Amerikaner, put out a New York Times op-ed talking about the not only state-by-state disparities in educational investment and how that's distributed district by district. I think folks are quite familiar with those, but also looking within districts and school-by-school disparities, often along the similar lines of race and class that we see within the larger delineations. So it's important not only to understand what schools are spending per pupil, but also how that data is displayed and communicated to families. So I think there's a lot more the department can do to give guidance to states and districts on that as well. Touching a little bit on the higher ed side, I think folks will not be surprised, given some of our public comments we've made in the past and comments we've submitted in opposition to the changes that were made to for-profit college accountability regulations, specifically the gainful employment rule and the bar defense rule by the DeVos Department of Ed, that we expect a new negotiated rulemaking on both of those rules. Remains to be seen exactly when that will happen. But that's something that we do expect to happen, and they've already announced that they will be reviewing the Title IX regulation. We would expect a process to begin on that as well sometime this year. And finally, the topic of student loan forgiveness. We are supportive of student loan forgiveness, broad student loan forgiveness, and that builds on a lot of our work on Black student debt. There's a series of 9 different pieces on our site that talk about the challenges and the disproportionate challenges facing Black borrowers. Statistics like 12 years out, the average Black borrower has not made progress, not been able to make progress on paying off their loans, and nearly half being in default, shows that this is really just a racial equity issue at core. Right now, the Department of Education is reviewing their legal authority to forgive student debt. We believe they have that authority, and that they have the authority to extend the payment pause currently underway through the duration of this declaration of emergency. So these will be things that we're focusing on with the department as well. So turning now to the legislative side of things. Folks may be familiar with reconciliation now that we've gone through one process. I don't expect any real person with responsibilities to keep up with the minutiae of this at the federal government level. But it's important to know that there's another opportunity, right? There is an opportunity to make a significant amount of progress in a host of areas, much like what was done in the rescue plan. But I do think that this particular package may be a little bit more focused on higher ed this time around. And Ed Trust is a series of positions that certainly predate this immediate opportunity that we want to see memorialized in this next legislative package. And first and foremost is doubling the Pell Grant. It's something that our president and CEO John King has talked a tremendous amount about. that we've been supportive of for quite some time now, and have worked hand in glove with other organizations to advance. Recently, there's a letter submitted by 1,200 organizations, many of them institutions, but over 350 organizations, asking Congress to double the Pell Grant, either through reconciliation or the appropriations process, which I'll touch on in a little bit. So that remains a core goal of ours. We're also supportive of federal-state partnership to support debt-free college. That's important to go hand in glove with increasing Pell, just because we need states to stay at the table. It's their public education system. They're responsible for investing in it, and we don't necessarily want to give them an excuse to abdicate by increasing federal aid and them walking away. So that's a huge thing we want to achieve, and also creating real pathways to debt-free college for the majority of students is a core goal of ours as well. We're also interested in having dedicated funding for student supports for students while enrolled. Over 1/5 of students are parents, 38% are over the age of 26, a majority work. So there's a whole bunch of support needs that students need once they access higher education, but to ensure that they get through and get the credential at the end. And also, increased investment in universal pre-K. The Child Care for Working Families Act was a bill that we supported last Congress that would cap spending on child care for families under 150% of state median income. That would be done through a new federal-state partnership. There are also provisions in that bill to increase investments in universal pre-K. It's a little bit unclear where we're going with that as of now, but these remain, or I should say, it's a little bit unclear where the Biden administration is going with that as of now. We want to see this included in the reconciliation package this summer. Finally, and I'll move quickly through this just in the interest of time, all the guidance asks I outlined and the reasons why they're important, they're also backed up in many cases by legislation. So the Advanced Coursework Equity Act deals with our advanced coursework advocacy work. Educator Equity and Diversity, the Hawkins Centers support HBCU and MSI investment in their teacher preparation programs and clinical learning. We're supportive of that. Access to safe, equitable, and positive learning environments. These 3 bills are due out over the next couple of months. We'll be holding a multi-part briefing on school discipline reform in May, hosted by my colleague, Kayla Patrick. These bills all pertain to curtailing, ending the use of law enforcement officers in schools and refunneling that money into, mental health professionals, counselors, and other sort of rehabilitative justice practices. So, these are all the type of things that we're going to continue to advocate on that will be closely connected to a lot of those guidance asks. Same with higher ed accountability as well. So I want to move to the federal landscape and sort of the process in which we're looking at trying to get some of these things accomplished. Again, don't want to bog folks down with the minutia of all this, but want to give them a general sense of timing so they know when they might want to get their ass together, reach out to federal partners, reach out to federal policymakers, and know when the time is right to bring those up. So first, a quick overview. The U.S. House of Representatives, I imagine most folks will be familiar with the situation there. The only thing to really highlight here is that the Democrats have a very slim majority. So there's a tremendous amount of emphasis, on the Senate and how narrow that is. But in reality, the Democrats, Speaker Pelosi, can only lose 3 members on votes for the remainder of the year. And that goes without saying, even with the special elections coming up and things you may have seen headlines on, that's not really going to change. So functionally, that means any core group of 4 lawmakers can come together and decide they want to force the issue on a specific change. So that's just something to be aware of. There hasn't been indications of that yet, but I think we're in for a much more complex and longer process, I think, than we saw during the American Rescue Plan. The U.S. Senate, folks generally know it's 50-50. So there is pretty much no margin for error within the Democratic caucus, who are the majority. Things to flag here, just the ranking member on the Help Committee is new. It's Richard Burr, of Republican from North Carolina. He will be retiring at the end of this Congress, as will Senator Blunt, who is the ranking member on the Appropriations Committee for education funding. So some upcoming changes beyond 2022 to just file away for down the road. The Department of Education, folks are probably familiar. We have a new Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. That is his I guess, formal picture that's on the website. So a different tack there. He's the former Connecticut Education Commissioner and was confirmed by a 64-33 vote in March. His deputies, Cindy Martin, former San Diego Unified School District Superintendent, and Undersecretary James Gall, who actually testified this morning in committee, have yet to be confirmed. They are expected to be confirmed. They will be voted through committee next week. and then could be passed on the floor by the end of the month. So getting into the sort of pathway, before getting bogged down in the process side of things, I did want to note, the Biden campaign said a lot of things in this space as well, and it's important to have that as a framing before thinking about what we want to advocate for policy-wise. They said a lot of things that we were broadly supportive of, including tripling Title I of ESSA, investing more in ESSA Title III, IDEA, McKinney-Vento. On higher ed, you'll notice a lot of the things listed on the slide directly correspond to a lot of our core asks, so we're excited about that. But there are more details to come on this. The Biden administration has revealed part one of its reconciliation package, the American Jobs Plan. This does have some education-related provisions, funding to improve public school buildings, R&D at HBCUs and MSIs, expanding broadband access. It also does contain a $100 billion pot for workforce development, which could touch on things like Perkins CTE and WIOA that have some interaction, obviously, with educational institutions of higher education and K-12 schools. So that document was an outline, so we're still sort of waiting to see how that's going to be transformed into legislative language. And there's more to come. There's more to come in part two. The American Families Plan, I alluded to reporting on tuition-free community college, universal pre-K, but we don't have more specifics than that right now. So that'll be something to watch. We do expect that outline to be released by the end of the month. So that'll give us a better sense of what they want to emphasize in terms of larger packages, more investment, mandatory side spending. How are they going to do this? The header was probably a dead giveaway. It's probably going to be reconciliation. Right now, folks are talking about, well, we could do a bipartisan package of just roads and bridges, and then we could do a Democratic-only package of all the other stuff. It's a little unclear how we would get to that point and what the incentives would be. I think for either party to do that, that could happen. But I think the expectation is eventually you will end up back in a reconciliation pathway. So in order to do that, again, this is complex. We think we have a ways to go here. But first step would be passing another budget resolution. That could be the existing one that they already passed in February. Senator Schumer is representing that he has been given the green light to do that by the parliamentarian, but there's been no additional reporting on that, so that remains up in the air. Regardless, they will have to do another budget resolution process before getting to an actual substantive policy bill. So that's something to keep an eye out. Again, they'll have to decide when they want to fully commit to this and discontinue the Republican outreach. For the American Rescue Plan, that was about a 2-week process. I think that is not going to be that quick this time around. They have to agree on funding levels, so how much do they want to invest in each priority and what the priority should be. And then the actual process itself, write the bills, pass them, survive the Byrd Amendment challenges, so on and so forth. Speaker Pelosi has targeted House passage for the jobs plan, because that's all that's been released by July 4th. I think that is a fine timeline to set. It would not surprise me if it ended up much later or even after the August recess. Before wrapping up, I just wanted to flag too, there are appropriations process, right? So in normal times, this would be the marquee thing. This would be, the sole focus for folks to get their funding changes done. That is not the case. There's obviously the simultaneous mandatory side process, but still important. Tons of line items here. Biggest thing to know that this process has been capped through a pre-existing agreement for the past 10 years. That is not the case now. So we are in sort of uncharted territory. Theoretically, you could see large increases proposed. And that is, in some ways, what the Biden administration has proposed so far. They released a budget letter to Senator Leahy last week. That's been reported on as a budget document or skinny budget. It's actually less than a skinny budget, but it did outline a substantial increase to the Department of Education. Most of that is a $20 billion increase to Title I of ESSA. It also contains increases for IDEA, Head Start, and CCDBG. More as interesting, it said even less, I think, about higher ed. It did propose a max Pell increase by $400. I think we obviously want to see more than that. However, this discretionary process, you have to keep in mind, involves Republican votes and involves a 60 vote threshold. That's going to be a bipartisan negotiation no matter what. So it'll be interesting to see in additional documents like the American Families Plan, what do they do on Pell with that, and what kind of mandatory changes are they interested in making to the program. So I think that's a core thing to kind of remember, that they're much more constrained on this side of the ledger. So the process for this right now, you're going to see cabinet secretaries start to come up and testify. Normally they're testifying on a full budget. They're not this time around, so it could be a little bit strange. There's tons of programs that were not mentioned in the budget document that came out last week. C-Campus, TRIO, McKinney-Vento, a lot of things that many members of Congress care about. So they may be trying to push for more information on that. But in the meantime, they'll be focused on what the Biden folks have put out publicly. The full Biden budget is expected in mid-May. So be on the lookout for that. That'll give you a much clearer picture. And then also a budget resolution. Technically, a budget resolution is supposed to set funding levels for the appropriation process. It is not just a green light for reconciliation. It has another purpose. But they don't need to pass one to do appropriations. And indications are it's unclear, but it seems less likely that they will pass a fiscal 22 budget resolution specifically for the purpose of appropriations. But more to come on that. Additionally, this summer you'll see bills start to move. The Labor H or Labor HHS Ed appropriations bill is the one that governs education funding. So if you hear Labor H, that's what that's in reference to. It'll have line item investments in a variety of programs folks care about that I've already mentioned. It's unlikely to go to the House floor. It's only passed on the floor of Congress, a handful of times, 2 or 3 times in the past 20 some odd years. The reason behind that is it's a very controversial bill. Obviously, it has tons of things in the healthcare space that are hot button issues. So normally what happens is in September, there is a partial package, something called a omnibus or a continuing resolution passed, where you'll see a lot of the Labor H package just roll forward. So it'll essentially be maintaining last year's spending levels. And then in November, December, you'll see a final package that'll wrap up that funding year. And this will be a pattern familiar to most folks. It usually is how it goes now, almost every single year. So finally, I know we're coming up on time. Folks have questions, please put them in the chat. We can circle back to them. I know folks have been answering as we go, and I hope a lot of the resources have been helpful to you. But just wanted to touch on some other items of note. A lot of questions we get from the field are very logical, which is, we've heard of HEA, Higher Education Act, like that's been a reauthorization priority for quite some time now. What's going on with that? I think the pandemic essentially put that on pause, and the retirement of Senator Alexander, is going to put us in a place where it's just not expected to happen anytime soon. I think Senator Burr, has traditionally been more interested in the healthcare space, and early indications seem like we're not going to get super far. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but I do think in terms of advocacy and planning, the operative action should be taken around reconciliation, around appropriations. And then after those processes are concluded, towards the end of the year, we'll see where we're at. Obviously, 2022 is an election year, and sort of changes dynamics a little bit as well. But we don't expect HEA to be reauthorized this Congress. ESSA is actually technically up for reauthorization, even though I think there's been much less discussion of that. And we don't expect a deep dive on that either. Finally, very recently, technically this isn't the State of the Union, but a joint address to Congress has been scheduled. Speaker Pelosi has invited President Biden to come deliver that on April 28th. I think you can expect to see the American Families Plan before that, just because they'll want to talk about his whole vision for what this next package should be. So that is my hope. So that'll help us plan a little bit better. But folks should stay tuned for that, because there could be additional details on educational priorities that we care about. Wanted to touch as well, one thing that could happen that is bipartisan is the child nutrition reauthorization. Specifically, this is the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. Courtney's the expert on this for us, but generally it's long overdue, and there is bipartisan interest in accomplishing that. There's been action on the House and Senate, both publicly and behind closed doors, to start that process. So, in terms of how that's going to interact with things that may be, have had passed already through ARP, pandemic EBT, summer EBT, how those types of programs may be impacted by this, how it may be impacted by possible additional changes in reconciliation. All of that could come together in different ways. So it's just something to monitor going forward. And finally, the debt ceiling expires. This is just another thing to file away. It could be extended for a few months via emergency action, but eventually Congress will have to deal with that as well. So I know that was a tremendous amount of run through. I know we're coming up on time. This has been great to present to all of you all. I'm glad, it seems like most questions just going through quickly have been addressed. If there are more to put in, please do that. But here are emails too as well. So if there are specific questions we didn't get to, please reach out and just ping us, and we're happy to circle back and give more details as it goes. So with that, I know we are at time. Just checking the chat, but I think I am going to close this out. And thank you all for coming. We hope this was helpful. And we look forward to working with all of you all in 2021.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.